Welcome to the part 2 of session 1, Civilization and Technology. In this session, let's look at a few more civilizations and look at the technology that contributed to their existence. And let's also look at cities as part of these civilizations, which essentially allowed these civilizations to be remembered and to essentially exist. The Greeks are, in a sense, our cultural forefathers, not because of related to them, but because the Greeks influenced Western civilization, and it was ultimately Western powers that colonized most of the world, and they left they left us with remnants of Greek architecture, of Greek thought, and Greek culture, and through their conquests. And so we all, in some sense, owe a debt of gratitude as well as perhaps a debt of anger towards the ancient Greek civilization. The Greeks were great thinkers, but one of their fundamental inventions, which was also shared by the Egyptians a few thousand years earlier than them, was the invention of something called the Dioptre. The Dioptre is a piece of technology that allows surveying. It allows people to draw lines upon the earth. It allows people to locate themselves around the earth. And the Greeks used this to create clear, mathematically perfect grids laid upon a land or a terrain that did not perhaps allow for that to happen. But consider this, consider how powerful the grid itself is when laid upon this swooping terrain that you see in this image before you. And imagine the extent of perhaps human innovation and perhaps human hubris to impose such a rigid geometry upon such a smooth undulating piece of land. And this is perhaps the benefit as well as the challenges that technology poses upon us. And the Greeks, who were extremely humanist before humanism was something that we considered as a mode of thought, viewed this as a human intervention upon nature, and they viewed it as something heroic and something that was deeply moral as well. The Greeks gave way to the Romans, and the Romans, who were their cultural inheritors, were great innovators in the areas of technology as well as urban design. Although their architecture was sometimes derivative of the Greeks, they built on it, and they built figuratively on the architecture and allowed themselves to use the idioms of the Greeks to create something entirely new. And Rome, as you may know, is essentially a group of 7 hills along the Tiber River. And Rome itself was not a great environment to be in, simply because they did not have water, a question that still plagues a number of cities throughout the world today. And the Romans did not have an easy solution to solve this. They did not have having built their city in the hills, they did not have an easy way in which to source the water from, and that drove them to use their technology or to invent modes of technology that allowed this water to come to their city. To do that, they had to invent essentially concrete, something that they called opus cementatium. And here we can see 2 modes in which the concrete was used. Essentially, this is mass concrete, not reinforced concrete as we understand it today, but mass concrete supported by bricks and stone on either side. And essentially, it's used as a filler material and as a material that takes the load of all of the structure above, while it's faced with stone, which creates the impression of the building being built in stone or in brick. and they managed to use this concrete in a number of innovative ways, and some of which we will discuss today. They also took the arch, which was available to much of the world earlier, but they managed to use the arch in line with concrete and their ability to use concrete, and transformed it into something that was far more powerful as a building material than the people who came before them, than the civilizations that came before them. They also, as a consequence of developing the arch and the vault, also managed to use the dome in a manner that essentially created what we identify as Roman architecture today, and eventually became a symbol of imperial architecture regardless of the civilization for thousands of years, and it still is in many countries. Just think of the Washington, just think of any of the buildings in places like Washington, which was built thousands of years later, but still uses the Roman idiom of the dome and the vault to invoke that sense of grandeur that this civilization created. Anytime, anywhere, by anybody, and that allowed the idiom of Rome, or the architecture of Rome, to spread throughout the world and become symbolic of something more than just Rome itself. And you can see that in the triumphant arches of Rome, which we still build in different countries in different contexts, but they're still essentially a Roman idiom that we follow even to this day. But let's talk about how the arch, the vault, and concrete helped Rome to exist as a city. And the most important way in which they used this was in the building of the aqueduct. The aqueduct is essentially a means of bringing water from a particular place to another, even if it's at a higher elevation, through engineering. And the Romans were geniuses at engineering, and they essentially allowed their city to exist by bringing water from a much higher elevation far away, and allowed this water to come into their city through their aqueducts. And the first of which is called the Aqua Pia in 312 BC. And this is an image of the remains of the Aqua Pia, and you can see how they have used the materials that they invented, and also the arch and also the technology of the arch, to an extent that it still survives after nearly 2300 years, and it still survives in some form, and that's because of the technology that they invented and the way in which they've used this technology. And the Romans did this again and again and again, and they built a number of aqueducts, and they kept building them as the city grew. And while this may seem to be something that's responsive, the very fact that this water was allowed to come into Rome allowed this city to become perhaps the most powerful city of its time for a very long time, and certainly one of the most long-lived. Rome is called the Eternal City. And these aqueducts allowed the Roman city to exist in different forms, which is why we see these aqueducts built time and time again. The first one we saw was in about 300 BC. The next one is 125 BC. We then see another built in 52 AD, and then 226 AD, and then we see them in even as late as the 1600s. And the fact that the Roman Empire spread so far and spread so much meant that cities in other parts of the world, like this one, like the image that you see in Segovia in Spain, which also uses the aqueducts, allows another city in another part of the world to exist. And this is possible because of the spread of civilization and the technology that civilization carries with it as its software, if you will. The Romans were also great bridge builders, and you can see this is a famous Trajan's bridge, which was which was painted in 105 AD, and this was and the Roman bridge building, which once again used this technology of concrete and the arch and the vault, allowed the Romans to build to connect their empire, and thereby spread their idioms of urbanism and their culture throughout Europe and throughout the Mediterranean Sea, which was their center of life. The Romans were also great road builders, and they invented essentially road building as we know it today. And this is also and we hear this familiar saying that all roads lead to Rome, and this was quite literally true at that point of time, simply because these roads allowed the empire to exist, and at the same time they invented this technology of building these roads, and the army built them so well that they spread to a number of cities in the empire. And this is a road that we see in Pompeii, which was buried in the volcano, and therefore this is one of the best preserved Roman roads in the world today. We then move on to perhaps the most pervasive technology in urban design, which is the wall, the city wall. Now, the city wall was essentially a response to the city becoming something that needs to be protected. It became something that required a barrier, a shield from invaders who wanted what the city had. And so we start to see the attacks on cities rise up from people who wanted perhaps from another city, or people who were tribesmen who wanted the wealth of the city, because the wealth even in its earliest forms was concentrated in the city. And the wall was built as a response to these invasions, and we can see that and even as early as the Greeks, we start to see machines to attack walls and to cross walls, and you see that in the Iliad and in a number of other early Greek texts and early European texts, and even all over the world, even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find these attacks on cities, and we find walls being the first line of defense in cities. And most cities throughout the world, except for perhaps port cities, and even sometimes even they were walled through most of their history. And we see this pervasive throughout the world. This is from China, this is from Europe, and this caused a fair amount of destruction, and this caused a fair amount of and this produced a fair amount of bloodshed, and was also very profitable if you were the one doing the attacking and you won. So the wall stands as a symbol of a city's resistance, and it also evolves along with the city, but it also evolves along with wars and the technology of war. This is perhaps one of the oldest walls that we know of. This is from the city of Buhel in ancient Egypt, circa 1800 BC, and the gate of Ishtar. And so we see this in Babylon, and we see this resistance take on not just functional dry value, but it starts to become part of the city. It starts to become part of the city's character. It starts to become an important piece of urban design, as well as being a piece of military resistance. In medieval Europe, the wall was very important, because a lot of people spent a lot of their time either attacking cities or defending them. And this is something that we see happen throughout medieval Europe, and even in medieval India, where we have the great Deccan forts all over the Deccan, which protected which protected each other, which protected its citizens from attacking armies. But as these armies started to grow, they started to also invent technology to defeat the wall. And these are a few medieval siege engines, some called the catapult, which is a very early, which is a very modern catapult compared to what the early armies used, and then the trebuchet, and then the ballista, which were all essentially technology that was invented to circumvent the technology of the wall itself. This led to the wall being more than just a physical thing. This led to the wall being a far more complex object of urban design than just a simple structure which blocked the invaders. It started to be more, and this is of course one of the great examples of the Great Wall of China, which was built to protect the Huns. And this is of course pre-medieval, but nonetheless it is a wall that is more than a wall. As discussed earlier, we see this in a number of forts in India, in the Deccan Plateau, as well as in the north and the northwest of the country. And we start to see these walls becoming emblematic of the city, and the city gate and the city wall become the first thing that a visitor or an enemy would see when they think of the city, and it would be something that they would see when they look at the city as outsiders. And we see this again in a number of different cultures, in a number of different ways, and each of these is a response to not just to protection, but also takes on its own character as something that is emblematic of a particular culture and a particular civilization. And the walls, as a result of a number of these different siege engines, start to become very free flowing. They start to become an almost organic shape, simply because that would allow these engines to essentially hit parts of the city. So the stones in the trebuchet would end up hitting a part of the city that nobody was in, simply because the shape of the city was essentially unknowable to the people outside. And that led to these free flowing organic forms that we see in a number of cities throughout the world at this particular time. And the wall dictates that shape. But then the same flat, sinuous, curving wall becomes a liability with the invention of gunpowder, and essentially gunpowder becoming not just a leisure tool or a toy, but when gunpowder starts to be used for warfare as artillery, then that directly affects the form in which that cities take. And so we then start to see the disappearance of these long sinuous curves which formed wall cities, then start to take a more rigid geometric shape, like the famous star forts of Europe of the Renaissance and the late Renaissance. And the star forts essentially evolved because they would present a smaller surface area for the cannon to hit, and the cannonball, even if it hit one spoke of a star, would not damage the city main or the heart of the city, and parts of the city could be protected even if parts of it were destroyed by the cannons. And this this created these complex shapes and these complex forms that were essentially derived from a very star-like geometry, which presented more and more surfaces. And a number of these fort cities start to display this behavior as they go on. And a famous example even in India is Fort St. George in Chennai, which was built in the 1600s, which is essentially of its time, and it's meant to be a fort that prevents invasion that prevents cannon fire through its configuration as such. But then we start once the cities evolve to escape this essential attack of a technological invention of the cannonball, the technology advances, the technology evolves to something more than just throwing a solid mass at a wall. This leads people then start to look for ways in which to transcend the wall. Then comes the invention of the explosive. Now, the explosive presents a unique challenge to a wall, because you can place multiple explosives at different parts of the wall, and the wall can crumble either in one place or it can crumble in a number of different places at a time, which makes this concept of a star spoked wall presenting a number of surfaces almost irrelevant. And this explosive shell, which is essentially an explosive fitted into a form of cannon, which means that the explosive not only is restricted to a place, but it can now move across the wall and move into the wall, creates another step in the evolution of the walled city. And people then start to look at the wall as not just something that is both decorative and restrictive. They start to look at the wall as a means in which to retaliate through attack, which was always part of the wall's function. But it also the invention of the explosive meant that you could do that in a number of different places in a number of different ways, and this leads to the evolution of the polygonal fort in the mid 1800s and early 1900s. And this is a picture of Fort Dioptre, which will become quite important in the next few slides that we see. And this leads, and these walls are not just built for protection, they are also built, they also have guns on each of the turrets, which allows the people on the wall to also fire back, not just be recipients of fire, not just be recipients while they are under fire. And because weapons become lighter, weapons become transportable, this becomes easier and easier and easier as we go on. But something fundamentally changes, something radically questions this idea of protecting the city through something like a wall. And we start to see, and that question is raised by the invention of the airplane. Now, the airplane was invented primarily as a mode of transport for individuals, and people could travel from place to place. But in World War I, which was the first industrial war, because this was, or rather it was the first enormous war after the Industrial Revolution, created the aeroplane as or rather led to the aeroplane being viewed as something more than just a means of transport, or just something that was fancy, but as a way of dropping arsenal onto a city. And this is something that the concept of aerial bombing was invented or rather perfected, if you will, in the First World War. And we start to see this becoming extremely common. And at the Battle of Verdun, the same fort that was perfect example of a polygonal fort that prevented explosive arsenal, is actually a victim of a huge bombing raid in the Battle of Verdun. And this leads to people starting to question the value of the walled city as a concept, as something that allows, as something that beats back an invader. And if you look at, and it's after the First World War that we see the disappearance of the wall as a defensive ring around a city, because from this point onward, the city is not defensible, at least not through a wall. And we see, therefore, we see one of the oldest traits of urban design, which dates back from thousands of years. Even cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and Memphis were walled cities. That technology just disappears, and it disappears, or that mode of urban design just disappears, and it disappears because of a particular form of technology. And this is perhaps one of the most fundamental examples of how technology changes urban design at a very fundamental level. And it is one of the best examples of how the form of the city is directly impacted by the evolution of technology. And you see this in a number of different places and in a number of different countries, and this allows for, and this creates something new. But let's talk about, and this is an image of the devastation of bombing, and we can see that as I said earlier, the wall is no longer the defense, and the defense has to come through some other means, but the wall itself can no longer do it. But let's talk about one more wall, perhaps the best known urban wall of the modern era, and this is, of course, the Berlin Wall. Now, Berlin is in the heart of East Germany. It was very much surrounded by East Germany. But however, in the Second World War, the Germans, the Allied powers of the West and the Russians occupied two parts of Berlin, and the parts that were occupied by the Allies became by the Western powers became West Berlin, and the parts of Berlin controlled by the Soviets became East Berlin. In the 1950s and early 60s, because of a number of political tensions, the city of West Berlin was walled off, and this created one of the most famous urban structures that you will ever see, called the Berlin Wall, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And if this image shows you the impact that the wall had on the morphology of Berlin, and you can see that the wall, primarily which was a political construct, breaks the free flowing morphology of Berlin, and essentially cuts this city into two. And this takes on a very powerful shape. And if you've read any of the great spy thrillers of that era, you will find that the wall itself is something that evokes a number of emotions in a number of people. And the wall transcends, and the Berlin Wall begins as something that is preventive, but then it becomes this symbol of something more. You have children trying to climb it in this particular image, but it becomes a cultural artifact. So the wall evolves; it becomes something more than just something that is built for a political reason. It becomes a symbol of a number of things. And when the wall finally falls in November of 1989, it leads to one of the great celebrations of history, and this urban artifact, this piece of what is essentially urban design, becomes this great symbol of unification of a country, and perhaps, in a sense, more importantly, a city that transcended politics and became something that became the beginning of a mass movement. And so, we see at the end of this session on technology and civilization, we see that at every stage of our history as a civilized species, technology has played an important role, and technology will continue to play an important role in urbanism, the existence of the city, and most relevant to us in urban design. Thank you.